I've got an example of one here I picked up in Williamsburg, Virginia here a few years ago, talking about the sinfulness and pernicious nature of gambling. And then this is interesting, but you go through there and you take a look at some of those sermons that he collected back during the day. I think some of our politicians would be wise to read and study up on some of these here. You can see one was on the political advantages of godliness, the discourse on national sins. Washington Collected was a great collector and subscribed to the publication of some sermons there, taking a look at his life. His theological vocabulary was pretty vast, and you see over 1,000 instances throughout his life of him talking about God and providence and titles for God and biblical, referring to different texts and so forth. He certainly encouraged the work of clergymen and chaplains. There were some 60 pastors, clergymen, that visited Mount Vernon during George Washington's life, and they would come and spend the night there and stay there at Mount Vernon. There were some 40 pastors that he corresponded with from around the country. He certainly saw their impact. He brought them into his army during the War for Independence. He certainly was very involved, and some of his closest friends were pastors. He certainly believed in the power of prayer. And we know that because he prayed, which obviously goes against this idea that he was deistic. A deist believes that God created and then turned his back on creation and left us to work everything out ourselves. Washington believed in the power of prayer because we know he did it. And he certainly was a very private man, which I mentioned earlier. His granddaughter was asked some 34 years after his death to sort of remark about what she observed from her grandfather and his Christianity. And she just simply talked about him attending the church there in Alexandria when the weather permitted. It took him 2 or 3 hours to get to church, though, by carriage. And you can imagine how weather would sometimes hinder that. She talked about him as being his custom to retire to his library at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, where he remained an hour before he went to his chamber. She says, I never witnessed his private devotions. I never inquired about them. I should have thought it the greatest heresy to doubt his firm belief in Christianity. And then she goes on to talk about sort of not being one to act or pray, to be seen of men. And she said, is it necessary to certify that one should certify George Washington avowed himself to be, to me, a believer in Christianity? And she certainly believed that he was. There's his library there, where she talked about him retiring to, where he would spend and commune with God there. You know, there's a very famous story of George Washington at Valley Forge during that very severe winter of 1777 and 78. The army was his army was in shambles. There was disease that was running rampant, smallpox. This is another sort of interesting thing here where I think God is bringing him along, preparing him. You know, he contracted a very mild case of smallpox while he visited his brother Lawrence in Barbados as a young man, which I happen to believe helped build up his immunity and allowed him to walk around and be part of his army during these very severe outbreaks. And smallpox was an unbelievable disease that they had to face during the day. But they lacked a lot of warm clothing and supplies, you know, there at Valley Forge. Lived in these huts, eating dry fish and what they called fire cake, which was nothing more than cornmeal and or wheat mixed with water. But it was a rough winter. And we know that there was one gentleman, a guy named Isaac Potts, and he's the guy that's, if you can see in the picture, in the very distance there, he's peeking around from this painting here, a tree, and supposedly he reportedly found George Washington on his knees praying. And Potts says, if George Washington be not a man of God, I'm greatly deceived, and still more shall I be deceived if God do not, through him, work a great salvation for America. And, you know, there's a little bit of debate whether or not this story is accurate, the way it was passed down through history. But that being the case, we do know that there were a lot of other people that during their lifetime spotted George Washington praying. And there you see some of those men that would stop, maybe catch him in his tent praying, all of which goes contrary to the idea that he was a deist. He certainly believed in prayer. Now let me say this. I want to talk about 3 lessons very briefly that I think that we can take from the life of George Washington. We can emulate, we can take a look at. And the first one is certainly this, is that God is in control. And Washington proclaimed some 270 times he talked about providence. He would talk about God, or he would talk about God's hand in history. One of the greatest stories that I love pointing out and sharing with my students goes all the way back to the French and Indian War. It's called the Battle of the Monongahela here. The British are marching to take Fort Duquesne, and George Washington is just a very young officer, and they walk right into an ambush by the French and Indians. And a long 2-hour battle ensues, and there were huge casualties that the British suffered. In fact, George Washington had 2 horses shot out from underneath him during that battle. In fact, he took his coat off after that battle as a young man and found 4 holes in his coat from musket balls that had went through his sleeve, through his coat. And he later told his brother in a letter, he said, "By the all-powerful dispensation of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation." And obviously we know God had his hand about George Washington because God had a plan for George Washington. And what's even more exciting is, and certainly this had to have been reinforced in Washington's mind in a more profound way, 15 years later, Washington went back to this battlefield with a good friend of his, Dr. Craik, and was showing him the battlefield. And word had gotten around to a local and an older Indian chief that George Washington was coming back here. And he was able to sit down with George Washington with an interpreter, and he told George Washington this. He said, "During that battle, I instructed all of the warriors that fought underneath me. We ordered them to shoot at the officers. The officers were on horseback. He said, take out the officers and you'll set the army in disarray." And he said, "Quick, let your aim be certain," and he dies. And they couldn't hit George Washington. He wouldn't die. And this Indian chief said, "Seeing that you are under the special guardianship of the Great Spirit, we immediately cease to fire upon you." And he said, "The Great Spirit protects the man," pointing to Washington, "and guides his destinies, and he will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire." And he said, "I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle." And you talk about the providence of God. George Washington never forgot that. In fact, locally there in Virginia, this story got passed down, and there was a pastor, Samuel Davies from Virginia there, who later became president of Princeton University, heard about this, heard about young Washington, and didn't receive a scratch. And he said, "To the public I point out that the heroic youth, whom I cannot but hope Providence has preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country." And how almost prophetic that seems, but they certainly saw the hand of Providence right there in the life of George Washington. And certainly during the American Revolution, we see that too. George Washington said the hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more wicked that has not gratitude to acknowledge his obligations. Washington said, listen, the hand of God is very evident in what is going on and with the army and his own protection. And he said, it's just obvious and we should see it. Just before the Declaration of Independence was signed, and I alluded to this earlier, right there on Long Island, George Washington